Hello. I'm excited for this new weekly check-in that I'm doing. Um, I'm live on Patreon right now as well as live on YouTube, and I had originally said that these weekly check-ins were going to be just for patrons, but I've decided that I want them to be for the public as well because I think the stuff that we're going to cover here is really important, and so I don't want anyone not to have access. So, as I said last week, I think these little weekly check-ins are going to be largely Bible interrogation and Bible um, experiencing. And that partly is for me. I am a person who grew up in a faith tradition, but didn't grow up with a whole lot of Bible. And the Bible, of course, is a very complicated text. It is many things to many people, including trauma. And I want to name that the Bible is full of ugly stories and people doing ugly things. The Bible is also full of miracles, and the Bible is full of people doing wonderful things. And that's why I see it as the spiritual story of humanity. And humanity is not all miracles. Humanity is not all good and right and holy at all times, or at least doesn't act it that way. And so the Bible tells that story of people making mistakes. And then in my tradition, the Bible is also about Jesus teaching us about God and what's possible when we believe that there is something big out there, something bigger out there. And as many of you know, I am a children's liberation theologian, and you might be wondering what that is. You might have other people who wonder what that is and that you want to talk more about it because it sounds intriguing to you. So I thought today we would get into a little bit, maybe just an introduction even of what children's liberation theology is and how I came to this work. I will share with you that we're going to be looking at Matthew 19 today, verses 13 through 15. So if you want to look it up and follow along, you can do that. And I use the NRSV. Actually, I just ordered a new inclusive Bible. It's called the Inclusive Bible, and I'm really excited about it. So hopefully next week I'll be reading from a different Bible. I have been doing what I was calling children's advocacy work in the church for many years. And it wasn't until I took a Black theology class in my last semester in seminary. Hi, sweetie. Speaking of children. I took a Black theology class in seminary. It was my last semester of seminary. It also happened to be James Cone's last class that he ever taught before he died. And I had not taken a liberation theology class in seminary. And a lot of people studied with James Cone. A lot of people came to Union because James Cone was there. I was not familiar with James Cone before I came to Union. And so my final semester, I signed up for his Black theology class to cover a requirement. And I realized that in reading the materials to prepare for the class and then eventually listening to his lectures, that what I had been doing over the years was children's liberation theology. And so Dr. Cone mentored me in using this language of liberation theology to talk about what happens in the human experience in terms of how we traumatize each other and oppress each other and what God has to say about that. And so I consider children's liberation theology to be sort of an extension of Black liberation theology and other liberation theologies. There are queer liberation theologies, womanist liberation theology, feminist liberation theology, and so on. And so I will So I'm going to talk more about how children's liberation theology is related and different from these other liberation theologies. But first, let's look at the text today. And again, it's just 3 short verses coming from Matthew 19, 13 through 15. And this story is also in Mark and Luke. So I often think that when a story about Jesus is mentioned more than once in the Gospels, that it's pretty important. And so this one being mentioned in 3 of the Gospels seems really important. So here's what it says. Then little children were being brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them. But Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. This verse for me, this part for me, is where children's liberation theology starts. And basically, what I'm seeing here is Jesus saying that there should be no one who does not have access to Jesus, that age, generation does not separate, does not give anyone a good reason to separate someone from experiencing Jesus's love. And what's also interesting about this is that the disciples, who they themselves were sinners and folks who experienced oppression, were shooing the children away, right? So these people who were followers of Jesus and experienced certain kinds of oppression, either because of that or in other parts of their lives, were then oppressing children. And so that is why I see children as the most oppressed population in the world, because children can be oppressed by the oppressed. And children have no power. We don't give children power in this country, especially. They don't have the right to vote. Children have very little say in what happens actually over the course of their childhood. And so children are the oppressed of the oppressed. Now, what is liberation theology exactly in terms of how it relates to God? Well, James Cone says that God is on the side of the oppressed. God is on the side of the oppressed. And so children's liberation theology states that God is on the side of children, and that Jesus is also oppressed and represents that oppressed population. And we see that in that Jesus was born via human birth. Jesus was born a baby. He experienced a childhood, and he experienced being a teenager and a young adult. And so children's liberation theology is lived through Christ, and children's oppression is lived through Christ. And so children's liberation theology, again, understands that God is on the side of the oppressed, and children, through the experience of Christ, are the most oppressed population in the world. And it is the responsibility of the community to do 2 things. One is to engage our own liberation. We cannot liberate children if we are not liberated ourselves. We cannot participate in the liberation of children if we don't understand what liberation looks like for ourselves. And so we have to liberate our own selves in order to participate in the liberation of children. And so the community is responsible, not parents, although parents take on some of that responsibility, or caregivers or guardians take on some of that responsibility. But just as the world is not set up for children, the world is not set up for parents to be the liberators of their children. Again, that is the responsibility of the community. And that's what makes children's liberation theology a bit different than other liberation theologies, because these other liberation theologies are written about and talked about from that community. They are talked about from the group that is experiencing that oppression. Children's liberation theology, in the way in which I engage it, is that it comes from our own liberation as adults and in whatever oppressed situation we are, but that we were all children at one time. We were all children at one time. So we can stop the cycle of oppression by liberating ourselves and passing that liberation to children. So that's the short of it. That's the short of what liberation theology is. And for me, all of this trickles into how I parent, how I work, who I work with, and why I do this work. And like I said, I just wanted to give you a brief introduction today, but we're going to talk more about children's liberation theology. We're going to talk probably about intergenerational worship and intergenerational church culture, and what does that have to do with children's liberation theology. And I'm also happy to answer your questions about it. There are a lot of questions, and I'm sure I can think of some things that people might want to talk more. So if you have questions, certainly send me a message on Instagram or here on Patreon, or comment on YouTube. And let me know what your thoughts are on this. Let me know what you're thinking about and what comes up for you when you hear about children's liberation theology. And thank you for joining me today. If you want to see more of what I do, certainly join me here on Patreon and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on Instagram. Tomorrow, I will be live on Instagram with Candace Simpson. She is a minister and host of the podcast Fish Sandwich Heaven, which is just this amazing, amazing ministry that she has. And we're going to talk about Fish Sandwich Heaven tomorrow and the non-traditional and uninstitutional ministry that Candace Simpson engages. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I'll be back next week for another check-in, and I look forward to seeing you on the internet in the meantime. Have a great day. Bye.